I am so happy to be here with Kristen Ghodsee, and we're gonna discuss her book, which is incredible. It's called Everyday Utopia: What 2,000 Years of Wild Experiments Can Teach Us About the Good Life. But first, I'm gonna read your little introduction, which I have here. Okay. Kristen Ghodsee is a professor and chair of Russian and East European Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and the critically acclaimed author of Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism and Other Arguments for Economic Independence, which has been translated into 15 languages. She's also the author of Everyday Utopias: What 2,000 Years of Wild Experiments Can Teach Us About the Good Life. Her writing has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, among other outlets. She's appeared on PBS NewsHour, as well as dozens of podcasts, including NPR, Ezra Klein Show, and she lives outside of Philadelphia. Okay, so I'm so excited to have Kristen here to talk about her book, really to focus on, I know it's a big topic, but how we can reimagine, well, this is what her quote, but how to live our daily lives. And this is the quote: dreaming up better ways to organize how we live together, pool our resources, raise our children, and determine who's part of our families. So I came to a book reading of yours through mutual friends, Annie Finch at NYU, and I was like, oh my God, like she's been researching this. This is incredible. And I read the book, and systematically you kind of went through all these things, which we can hopefully make it through, but the different ways to organize how we live, how we raise our children, allo parenting, all these things which really can contribute to everybody having a better life. So I know we have a short time to get through a lot, but thank you so much for being here. So
yeah, thank you for the invitation.
Experiments of collected living, super interesting. If you want to just launch into
that. Let me start. Yeah, I think that the key thing, right, is that I have like a kind of a sound bite for the book, right? Which is that the way that we organize our domestic lives, the way that we organize, can you hear me?
Yeah.
You can hear me. Okay, I wasn't sure because so the way that we organize our domestic lives, yeah, I can hear you, but there's like an echo. So I just want to make sure that it's okay. Basically, we have this model of so the way that we organize our private lives, or the way that we think of as ideal to organize our private lives in the 21st century, which is the idea that the romantic couple, generally heterosexual, but not necessarily, but it is a romantic couple, is the appropriate container for parenthood. And that those two parents provide relatively exclusive biparental care to their own biological offspring in their single family home, surrounded by bunches of their privately owned stuff. Right. That's sort of like the ideal to which many people aspire. And I actually argue in the book that this ideal of the family, what we might call the nuclear family, supplemented by the single family home and private property, is a huge part of the problem that's exacerbating various crises that we're facing in the 21st century. So the environmental crisis, the crisis of loneliness and isolation, the crisis of care for both the young and the elderly. And I also think the crisis of inequality, which I believe is a really important crisis that we're facing. And so this book is an attempt to say, what have people done, going all the way back to prehistory, and then starting historically with Pythagoras, like 2,500 years ago. What are the ways in which people in different eras and in different cultural circumstances across different continents, what are the things that they have in common about the way they organize their private lives to make them able to live more in harmony with nature and with each other?
It's so incredible. So for me, so we have two things to say. First is like the structure of the houses, if you would like to talk about that, and then we could get to the child rearing. I've raised two amazing children, and I was lucky enough to have a community and amazing friends, and I lived on a street where I knew other people lived who had children. We kind of raised our families, in a way, and it was really important to us to have community, to me and my husband, and we really had that as a value. But I can't imagine ever raising children without that. So if you want to talk about maybe the structures, the actual physical way that houses are constructed, and then on to the ideas about parenting and allo parenting, which I just find so
fascinating. So allo parenting, so there's a whole chapter of the book that's called Home is Where the Walls Are, and it looks at different ways of imagining architecture, again, cross-culturally and trans-historically. And one of the things that I'm really excited about in the book is this thing called the Plan of St. Gall, which is a architectural blueprint from Switzerland that was drawn between 820 and 830 AD. So this is a 9th century Carolingian ideal Benedictine monastery. And when we think about the Benedictines, these are Cenobitic monastics, and it's a bunch of people who are non-related living together in a self-sufficient commune, basically. And the architect of the Plan of St. Gall was using the rule of Saint Benedict of Nursia, which is a document from 530 AD about how a bunch of non-related people could live together in harmony. And the thing that's really important is that even though Catholic Cenobitic monks and nuns were celibates, they often raised children because they took in orphans, they took in unwanted children, illegitimate children, things like that. And so there's this sort of imagining of what an ideal monastery would look like. And one little detail that I absolutely love is, how can you guarantee that a whole bunch of people who are not related living together in a big compound will be happy? What is the key secret to that? Do you know? Lots of bathrooms.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they knew that in the 9th century. Lots of bathrooms. If you have lots of bathrooms, you're going to be fine. But basically,
to share. You can share meals, but sharing a bathroom space, not so.
Yeah, sharing a bathroom space is like the one thing. Even in the 9th century, they knew that. But like that model of monasteries ends up influencing dormitories. Because a lot of the dormitories, when Oxford and Cambridge were founded in the 13th century, the students were initially housed in monasteries, and then they built dormitories based on the monasteries. And so a lot of our ideals of collective living, at least in the West, come from these sort of more monastic forms of living. In the East, we can look at ashrams. In traditional indigenous societies, we could look at longhouses. All over the world, we can see that architecture was always much more capacious to include both sanguine and non-consanguine relatives and people in our community. So people that are blood related to us, but also people who are not blood related to us. And it's precisely the reason that this architecture existed is precisely because of what you just said. It takes a village to raise our children. And if you read the evolutionary anthropological literature on family forms and child rearing, we know that human beings are more or less cooperative breeders. Like, the reason that we have survived as a species for as long as we have, despite the fact that like our babies are incredibly helpless and we're really bad at reproducing because, our organs are not really well adapted. And if you've read Kat Bohannon's book, Eve, it really tells you a lot about how we have to raise our children together. And so, this idea of the allo parent, like the other adults in a child's life that are not necessarily that child's blood related kin in any way, are really important. And all across history, as far back as we have written records, and all across different cultures, whether we're talking about Asia or Africa or Latin America or indigenous societies in North America or Eurasia and Siberia, architecture has reflected this impulse that we have to raise our children more collectively. And it's only really in the global North where architecture has created this sort of single family box that isolates us. And I think you can see how rare it is when you think about the fact that people in their like 20s and younger are happy to live collectively. They have, flat shares and they live in dorms. And then at the end of our lives, when we get older, we move into retirement communities, which are basically kind of fancier dorms. And we have, we're playing bingo or whatever. We are really comfortable living with lots of other people and sharing spaces with other people. But the one time of our lives when we actually need to have other adults around, which is when we have young children, we isolate ourselves in the single family home. And in the book, I argue that the reason we do that is because the nuclear family is the primary institution in society which allows for the intergenerational transfer of wealth and privilege from largely fathers to their legitimate children.
And so it's directly related to capitalism. Right. So that's kind of why we have this system. Okay, I want to go through a couple things. So I know we're going to have. Can you talk a little bit about the Pythagorean one because that was super interesting to me, the roots of because I did not know about that at all. So
Yeah, so Pythagoras and his followers, but particularly Pythagoras, was very unhappy with the kind of socially imposed universal monogamy and nuclear family of mainland Greece. And they left mainland Greece and settled in what was then Croton. Today is, it was like larger Greece, but today it's Sicily in Italy. The town still existed. It's called Crotone. And they basically formed, what we might think of as the first kind of commune of men and women living together equally and sharing all property in common with others, not necessarily people who are blood related. And they made their lives quite simple in order to free themselves to explore the mysteries of mathematics and the universe. And so, one of the things that I say in the book, which I think is really important, is that every single middle school student around the world or high school student learns about the Pythagorean theorem. They learn about like how do you calculate, the area of a triangle. But the key thing is that they never learn about the social conditions under which the Pythagorean theorem was produced, which is something really radical. It was a very early commune where men and women were treated equally and they owned all their property in common and they raised their children collectively.
So you guys have to read. I highly recommend getting the book. I'm going to say this again because that to me, I had never heard of this. I just sort of knew the Pythagorean theory barely and had no idea. Okay, I know we have to talk quickly, but I think we should talk a little bit about what people, well, two things. We talked about Nashira before, so before we get to Nashira, you talk about living on a kibbutz too, and what worked and what didn't, and I think we should bring that up considering that where we are today. But yeah, a little bit of what worked, what didn't work, your experience. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that like by the time that I got to the kibbutzim, which was in 1990,
1990.
I was on kibbutz 1990. I was on kibbutz Hatzarim. Many of the kibbutzim in Israel at that time had abandoned collective sleeping, right? So these were kibbutzes that were raising children in what were called children's homes, and so children did not sleep with their parents at night; they slept together. And that was there were all sorts of reasons. The first kibbutz was founded in 1909 when this part of the world was still under the Ottoman Empire. So you have to understand that like this was a long process that well predated the foundation of the state of Israel. And they were, largely Ashkenazi immigrants coming from the Pale of Settlement. And anyway, long story short, they experimented with a lot of very collective ways of living, which has roots back in perhaps the Essenes, which is a group of people who existed between the 1st century BC and the 2nd century AD. It's a really interesting long history. By the time I got to the kibbutz, it was, there was still a great sense of collectivity. People still owned all of the property in common and they shared all their income, but there was a kind of rolling back of some of the collective childbearing that they had done. But for me, having grown up in the United States in a single family home in the suburbs, it was an amazing experience to suddenly be in this collective community and to realize that there are other ways of organizing our lives that really prioritize cooperation and connectivity over competition and isolation.
Right. That's amazing. Okay, so there are a lot of practical things in your book too, because you were dreaming of these new kind of, I guess you call them your last chapter, your radical dreaming. But I want to ask you one question. A lot of concrete things you talk about too that could be changed in the United States: free childcare for young children, the education system, how we learn, how our kids learn, maternal, parental leave. Can you talk about some of those things that are kind of things that could be changed within our current system that are in a way political that we could be advocating for and why they're so important to this? Yeah. collectively rearing of children?
Yeah, so I talk about a lot of different actual concrete policy suggestions in the book. Some of them are like universal, childcare for children between the ages of like 2 and 6. I talk about education. I talk about, reimagining how we live and who we can live with. There are all these zoning laws that prevent people who are not blood related to each other from living in a house together. And I think we need to abolish all of those rules. But one of the things that I think is really important, at least personally, is that a lot of states still only allow two names on a child's birth certificate. And given the reality of the world that we're living in with step parents and blended families, with gay couples who might have a surrogate and an egg donor and they want to include those women, or two women who might have a sperm donor, or with mitochondrial replacement therapy, it's a technology that's still illegal in the United States, but it's definitely coming down at us. Before the war, it was legal to do it in Ukraine. You can legally and scientifically actually have a baby with the DNA of three parents because you have two mothers and one father. So our notion of parenthood, our notion of guardianship is completely outdated given the reproductive technologies that we have today and the forms of families that we have, both because of high divorce rates and blended families, and also because of LGBTQ plus relationships. So one of the very concrete suggestions that I make in the book is really reimagining what it means to have a family, like what it means to have parents. Like let's actually recognize allo parents, whether they're grandparents or godparents or chosen family. We should really allow our children going into the future to be parented by more people than just two. So there was a really important and controversial book that came out just, 6 months ago. It was called The Two-Parent Privilege by Melissa Kearney. And she's making this argument that two parents are definitely better than one. And so like all the single parents in our society are a problem because they're doing damage to their children. And my response to that is, well, if two parents are better than one, then three parents are better than two, and four parents are better than three, and five parents are better than four. So why not just expand our notion of parenthood? Because ultimately, in the long run, I think we need to live in a world where for people who want to experience parenthood, we need to be parenting more collectively, because it's not only better for our children, but it's better for us.
For us too. And I think we should mention, I mean, this does, I was just in DC lobbying for a living wage. And you see all these, I mean, I saw this particular film about these two women. I mean, they work 40 hours a week, which isn't enough time. They work 80 hours a week, and they still barely can support their children. They're not there. They have no paid maternity. I mean, the way our systems are set up are kind of making families stay poor and not thrive. I mean, so that's another thing I think you mentioned.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was actually at a conference last weekend in New Mexico, and I was speaking about alternative family forms, and this was like one of those conferences where they try to bring people from all parts of the political spectrum to have a conversation with each other. And so there was a guy who was kind of like a very, relatively conservative Lutheran Christian at this conference. And he was very pro-natalist. Like he really thinks that people should be having more babies, and that people want to have babies, but they're not able to have babies. And I was basically saying, like, we should expand our family forms, and we should be much more capacious in how we define parenthood and really take seriously the idea of allo parents. And I found myself saying that a big part of the problem is capitalism. And the weird thing was that this somewhat, somebody who I would not have necessarily allied myself with, a fairly conservative Christian man, basically agreed with me and said, yeah, capitalism is preventing people from having babies. Now, my goal is not to have people have more babies, but for somebody whose goal is to have, people, like, from a religious perspective, having more babies is really important to him. He also identified capitalism as part of the problem. So there was this weird way in which we were both having a conversation about the damage that capitalism is doing to our ability to thrive and survive in the 21st century.
Yeah, yes. Okay, so I'm going to just ask one last question. So we know that how am I going to say this? People tend to be very, worried, I think would be about legislating people's private lives. So that's what I wanted to ask you. When you get into the government interfering on private lives, which I think is important because our private lives are politically important, people may have a desire not to have their private lives legislated when it could be used.
Yeah, and
I want to ask you, yeah.
right. And in the book, the reason that I wrote this book was because my last book, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, really was about government policies. And this book is a completely different project. This is a book about like what we can do in the absence of states that are responsive to us, in the absence of democracy, in the absence of a political process whereby we feel like we can influence the state. This is about what we can do in the absence of the state. And I don't, this is where oddly, I feel like I sometimes, this sort of whole strange bedfellows things, that the anarchists, the left anarchists and the libertarians are often very suspicious of the state. They just don't want the state to legislate. Why is it that the state gives me a birth certificate with only two name slots on it for parents? Like the state shouldn't have anything to do with who my child's parents are. The reason that those birth certificates exist is in order to establish the legitimacy of the child so that tax law can do its thing when it comes time for inheritance. So in some ways, I think that my book, Everyday Utopia, and a lot of my recent work, oddly, because I tend to be a person who thinks that the state can do good things, and I think we should participate in the democratic process in order to influence the state, keep imagining ways of being in the world that will allow us to live, more capaciously our vision of the future. Anarchists often talk about what's called prefigurative politics, which means living in the world today as if the world that you want to see in the future already exists. And I think that's a beautiful idea.
That's amazing. Okay, so the end of your book, you wanted to end these conversations on a hopeful note, because we do need to have hope. And the title of your last chapter is How Radical...
The Star Trek Game Plan.
Yeah, and how hope defeats dystopian despair. So when you read the book...
How radical hope... Yeah.
So radical...
it's...
My last question, radical hope. Can you give
radical hope? So,
leave us
I will leave you with 45 seconds of why radical hope is so important.
Yeah.
We live in a world today where it is very hard to be hopeful without being accused of naivete, of like, how can you say that the future is going to be better when, as we know right now, the world feels like it's falling down around us between the climate crisis and the various wars and atrocities and genocides and things that are going on right now. How on earth are we supposed to be hopeful? Well, the answer to that question is there's always been things happening in the world. And the reason that we have survived as a species is that there were people out there who hoped and who believed that they could find a way through the morass of the present into some kind of future. And I think that hope, radical hope, is a political decision to say, as I look around the world and I see all of the anxiety and the despair and the pain, I refuse to give in to that anxiety and despair and pain. And I'm going to stand up and I'm going to argue that we together, if we find common cause, can build a better future. That the reason that is so radical is because people will discount you, people will ignore you, people will deride you, people will make fun of you, but you stand in the face of that derision and you say, no, I am going to make this world a better place. And we're going to do it together.
Wow. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful for this conversation, and I'm so glad we could end this on radical hope, which we all need. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the invitation. All right. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.